This is the second subject in the first part of what we're exploring. I hope you enjoyed the first episode on creation, and if you haven't seen it yet, I'd recommend going back and watching it first, because what we're doing here is building something. This is still the very early stage of a much larger series, one that aims to show how history, culture, religion, science, and philosophy can all be combined into a single, coherent narrative, in a way that hasn't been done before. Now let me ask you something. Would you believe me if I told you that maybe, just maybe, this theory can offer a logically consistent explanation for things like how the pyramids were built, why aliens could exist, yet we've never encountered them, or why stories of dragons and giants appear across cultures but leave behind no clear remains? Before I go any further, I want to be very clear about something. I don't want any of you to think I'm asking for blind belief. In fact, I want the opposite. As this series continues, I want you, every single one of you, to fact-check what I'm saying. If I say something that's wrong, misleading, or doesn't hold up, I want you to challenge it, publicly, in the comments. Hold me accountable, because I'm not a scientist, I'm not an academic or an engineer. And I wouldn't even call myself an artist. If I had to describe it, I'm a concept artist, and what I have is a concept. A strange one, but one that I've tried to ground. I'm not a mathematician, but I've used mathematics, checked through computation to support a scientific framework. So, if you trace that backwards, there's mathematics, supporting a scientific theory, attempting to describe a difficult concept that could potentially explain everything. Now, if you found your way to this video, you're probably here for one of a few reasons. You're interested in storytelling, or faith, or science, maybe all three. If you care about storytelling, then you already know. Stories are complex. You don't fully understand them at the beginning. They unfold. If you care about faith, then you know God is beautiful, but not simple. And if you care about science, then you know the universe itself is vast, layered, endless in its depth and structure. So we can at least agree on this. The things we're trying to understand are not simple. And if they feel confusing, if they feel disconnected, if they feel impossible to reconcile, then maybe the issue isn't the ideas themselves. Maybe the problem is language. And that's why this next part is about language. A word is not the thing. It never has been. It is not the object, not the idea, not the experience itself. It is something far smaller, a marker, a signal, a surface-level shape that points toward something much deeper. When I say a word, you don't receive what I'm thinking. You can't. What you receive is a prompt, a trigger, something that causes your mind to search inward and construct something that resembles what I meant. But what you build comes from you, your memory, your associations, your past experiences, your internal structure. So even if we use the same word, we are not holding the same thing. We are holding two separate constructions that happen to share a label. And most of the time, we don't notice, because the system works just well enough to keep moving forward. The conversation continues, the illusion holds. But underneath it, there is a gap, a quiet difference between what was intended and what was received. And that gap never fully closes. It can shrink, it can align, it can feel precise, but it is always there, because a word can only ever point. It cannot carry the full weight of what it represents, and everything that follows from language is built on top of that limitation. There is a difference between what you mean and what you say. And most of the time, you don't notice it, because the process feels seamless. A thought forms, you reach for a word, you speak, but something happens in between those steps, something subtle, something easy to miss. What you mean exists as a full internal structure, not just a word, but an entire arrangement, images, context, emotion, connections to other ideas, layers of meaning that sit on top of each other. It is dense, it is complete. And then you try to express it, so you compress it. You take that entire internal structure and reduce it into a sequence of words, linear, simplified, stripped down. And in doing that, you make a trade: clarity for speed, depth for shareability, precision for accessibility. What comes out is not the thing you meant. It is a version of it, a reduced form, a representation. And then it moves across the gap into someone else. But they don't receive your meaning. They receive your words. And from those words, they attempt to rebuild what you had in mind, using their structure, their experiences, their interpretations. So now, there are two transformations. What you meant becomes what you said. What you said becomes what they understood. And at each step, something shifts, something is lost, something is reshaped, something new can even be introduced. And yet, the conversation continues as if nothing has changed, as if meaning passed cleanly from one mind to another. But it didn't. It never does. There is always a gap between concept and between word and understanding. And everything built with language rests on top of that gap. We speak as if we understand each other, as if the words we use carry the same meaning for everyone involved. But they don't. They can't. Because meaning doesn't live in the word. It lives in the person. Take something simple. A dog. It's just a word. 4 letters. 1 sound. We say it as if it's stable, as if it points to something clear. But it doesn't. Because what that word activates depends entirely on who hears it. To one person, a dog is warmth, loyalty, a companion, something that sits at the end of the bed and waits at the door. To another, a dog is work, a tool, a function, something trained, directed, used with purpose. And to someone else, a dog is fear, noise, unpredictability, something that bites, smells, and leaves mess behind it. Same word, completely different realities, and none of them are wrong. They're all real, within the structure of the person holding them. So when we speak and we say dog, we assume alignment. We assume that what I mean is what you understand. But what's actually happening is overlap, partial alignment, just enough shared structure to keep the conversation moving. And because it works well enough, we call it understanding. We build trust on it. We build agreement on it. We build entire systems on top of it. But underneath, there is always variation, always difference, always a gap between what is said and what is actually meant on each side. Shared meaning is not truly shared. It is negotiated, approximated, held together by assumption, and most of the time, we never stop to question it. Now take everything we've just established and stretch it, not just between two people, but between entire languages, entire cultures, entire ways of seeing the world, because translation is not the movement of words. It's the movement of meaning, and meaning does not travel cleanly. You can take a word in one language and find its equivalent in another. On paper, it matches, dictionary to dictionary, symbol to symbol. But underneath that, the structure is different, the history is different, the associations are different. The way that word has been used over time in that culture is different. So what actually moves across is not the original meaning. It's the closest approximation, a reshaped version, something that fits but doesn't match. And sometimes that difference is small, barely noticeable. Other times, it changes everything. A phrase that feels neutral in one language can feel aggressive in another. A concept that exists clearly in one culture might not even have a word in another. So it has to be described indirectly, expanded, rebuilt from parts. And in that process, something shifts. Something is always lost, but it's not just loss. Sometimes something is added, new interpretations, new associations, new meanings that weren't there before. So translation doesn't just distort meaning, it evolves it, it transforms it. And if meaning is already unstable between two individuals, then across languages and cultures, it becomes something else entirely, layered, uncertain, in motion. So when you read something translated or hear an idea passed across cultures, you are not receiving the original. You are receiving a version that survived the journey, and everything that follows is built on top of that. Now take it one step further. Not just what is said, and not just how it moves, but what happens when something complex is forced into something simple. Because that's what language does. It takes something vast and reduces it. A full internal structure compressed into a word. Think about what exists inside a single idea. Not just the surface, but everything beneath it. Layers of memory, connections to other ideas, emotions tied to experience, context built over time. It's not flat. It's not simple. It's deep, structured, almost like something that keeps unfolding the closer you look at it. And then you try to express it, so you compress it. You take all of that depth and fold it down into a small symbol, a word, a sentence, something that can be passed quickly from one person to another. But in doing that, you lose resolution. Details disappear. Subtlety fades. Entire layers collapse into a single point. What remains is just enough to trigger recognition, just enough to rebuild something similar on the other side, but never identical, because the original was too large to carry across directly. So language becomes a system of fragments, small, simple pieces, that stand in place of something far more detailed. And when those fragments are received, they expand again, reconstructed differently depending on who receives them. So, the same small symbol can unfold into entirely different structures in different minds, and most of the time, we don't notice. Because the system works fast, it feels efficient, but what we're actually doing is constantly reducing something rich into something minimal, and trusting that it can be rebuilt on the other side. Language isn't high fidelity. It's practical, it's fast, but it is always low resolution. And everything we understand through it is shaped by that limitation. Think about what we've just been talking about. You can follow it, right? It feels coherent, it holds together, you understand the direction of it, but now ask yourself, how often do you actually stop and think about this process? How often do you notice what's happening inside a conversation while it's happening? Almost never. Because most of the time, language feels automatic. You speak, you respond, you assume it worked, and that assumption is where everything begins. Because if meaning is never transferred perfectly, and we've already established that it isn't, then every single interaction contains a small difference, a slight shift between what was intended and what was received. Most of the time, it's tiny, so small you don't notice it, but it's there. And then it happens again and again. Each time something is said, heard, remembered, repeated, it shifts, not dramatically, just slightly. A word leans a little in one direction, a phrase picks up a new tone, an idea gets simplified or expanded depending on who's carrying it. And because we don't stop to check it, because we assume understanding, those small shifts accumulate. Over time, they become something else. So misinterpretation isn't an exception. It isn't a mistake that happens occasionally. It's built into the process. It's happening constantly. In every conversation, every explanation, every retelling, and when you extend that across time, across years, generations, cultures, what you get is drift. Meaning doesn't stay fixed. It moves, it evolves, sometimes slowly, sometimes completely. So a word that meant one thing before can mean something slightly different now. An idea that started in one form can arrive somewhere else entirely. And still, We speak as if it hasn't changed, as if the meaning is stable, as if we're all still talking about the same thing, but we're not. We're talking through layers of accumulated shifts, small misalignments that have been carried forward again and again. Misinterpretation is not a flaw in language. It is the default state, and drift is what happens when that process is left unchecked. Now consider something even more subtle, not just what is said, but how it is said. Because language doesn't just carry words, it tries to carry feeling, tone, emotion, intent, and this is where it begins to struggle. Because some things don't compress well. You can describe an idea, you can point to an object, but how do you fully transmit a feeling? Not just name it, but actually move it from one person to another. You can say, I'm angry, I'm happy, I'm afraid. But those are labels. They're not the experience itself. They don't carry the weight of it, the intensity, the texture, the context behind it. So language reaches for something else. It leans on tone, on pacing, on emphasis, on the way something is delivered. A single sentence can mean completely different things depending on how it's said. The words stay the same, but the meaning shifts because something underneath the words is doing the real work. Subtext, what is implied, but not directly stated, what is felt, but not fully expressed. And this layer is unstable, easy to miss, easy to misread, easy to project onto, especially when the medium changes. In person, you have voice, facial expression, timing. But in text, most of that disappears. So the reader fills in the gaps, using their mood, their assumptions, their state in that moment. And suddenly, the same sentence can feel warm, or cold, or aggressive, or distant, even if the intention never changed. Because language cannot directly carry emotion, it can only point toward it, suggest it, surround it, and hope that something similar is reconstructed on the other side. But just like everything else we've explored, that reconstruction is never exact. And in that space, between what was felt and what was received, misunderstanding doesn't just exist, it multiplies. Now we reach a boundary, a point where everything we've been building toward starts to fail. Because language works up to a point. It can describe objects, it can describe actions, it can even describe complex systems, as long as those things can be reduced, structured, and passed across in pieces. But what happens when the thing you're trying to describe doesn't fit into pieces? What happens when it has no clear edge, no fixed shape, no agreed starting point? When it's abstract, when it's infinite, when it sits at the very base of everything else? Language begins to break, not gradually, but fundamentally, because language depends on distinction. This, not that. Here, not there. Before, after. It works by drawing lines, by separating one thing from another. But some things don't separate cleanly. Try to describe something infinite, not just very large, but something with no boundary, no end, no final point you can arrive at. Every word you use tries to close it, to contain it, but it can't be contained. So what you end up with is approximation or contradiction. Now try to describe first principles, the base layer, the thing everything else depends on. You quickly run into a loop because every word you use is already built on top of the thing you're trying to explain. So you end up using the system to explain the system itself. And it folds back in, again and again. You feel like you're getting closer, but you're moving in circles. And then there are experiences, things that can be felt but not fully said. You can gesture toward them, use metaphor, build structure around them, but the core of it never transfers. At best, you create a pathway for someone else to arrive there themselves. So, language reaches a limit, not because it's flawed, but because it was never designed to carry everything. It was designed to function, to be fast, to be useful, not to perfectly represent reality. And when we forget that, problems start to appear. Because people continue to use language as if it has no limit, as if every disagreement can be resolved with more words, more definitions, more precision. But often, the disagreement isn't in the words, it's in what sits beneath them. Two people argue, back and forth, using the same terms, but meaning different things. Each one confident that they are being clear. Each one hearing something different from what is intended. So the argument continues, not because either side is necessarily wrong, but because they are not aligned at the level that matters. And instead of stepping back and examining the structure, they push harder, repeat themselves, rephrase, emphasize, believing that more language will fix the problem. But it doesn't, because they are trying to resolve something that exists beyond the limits of the system they're using. And this happens everywhere, in everyday conversations, in relationships, in debates about truth, religion, science, meaning itself. People argue for hours, sometimes years, without realizing they are not actually disagreeing on the same thing. They are defending their internal reconstruction of a word, not the thing the word points to. So language reaches its edge. And beyond that edge, it cannot guide you any further. Not because there is nothing there, but because what is there cannot be fully carried by words alone. So if language has limits, if it compresses, distorts, and eventually breaks, then the question becomes, what sits beyond it? Because the things we've been pointing at don't disappear just because language can't carry them. They're still there, still structured, still real, still experienced. So how are they shared? Not through words, at least not directly, but through something deeper, through structure, through pattern, through experience itself. Think about it. There are things you understand without needing them explained. You recognize patterns in behavior, in systems, in the way things unfold over time, without anyone having to fully describe them. You feel when something is coherent. You notice when something is off, not because of the words, but because of the structure behind them. And sometimes, the most accurate way to communicate something is not to say it, but to show it, to build it, to let someone experience it directly. So instead of transferring meaning through compressed symbols, you allow meaning to emerge through interaction, through alignment, through seeing the same structure from within. And this changes something. Because now, the goal is no longer to describe reality perfectly, but to guide someone to a position where they can see it for themselves, where the understanding doesn't come from the words, but from what the words were pointing toward. And if that's possible, even in small ways, then it raises a bigger question. What happens when the tools we use to communicate start to change? When we're no longer limited to sound and symbol alone? When structure itself can be shared more directly? Not explained, but experienced. Not described, but understood from within. We're not there yet. But you can see the direction, because everything we've explored so far has been building toward this edge, the point where language stops being enough and something else has to take over. And that's where we go next. So, thank you for staying with me through this. I know this isn't light content. It asks you to slow down, to look at things you normally don't question, to sit with ideas that don't resolve immediately. And I appreciate that. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope something in it felt clear, not necessarily answered, but clearer. Now, at the beginning of this video, I made a pretty bold suggestion, and I haven't justified it yet. That's intentional. Because this isn't something I can just tell you. It's something that has to unfold, something you have to see develop, step by step. So for now, just ask yourself, have I misled you so far? Or have you started to notice something? Maybe in how creation was framed, maybe in how language shapes what we can and can't understand, maybe in the gaps. Because if there is even a small amount of clarity there, then we're moving in the right direction. And we're only just getting started. So take your time with it, think about it, challenge it, and I'll see you in the next one.